The International Court of Justice ordered Israel to take measures to limit harm to Palestinians in Gaza as part of its highly anticipated interim judgment today. A judgment that describes South Africa's allegations that Israel has committed genocide as plausible. Israel declared war on Hamas after the October 7th attack that killed more than 1,200 people. The Hamas-run health ministry in Gaza says an estimated 26,000 Palestinians have been killed by Israel since then. About half are children and women. The ICJ stopped short of calling for a ceasefire, but said Israel should take all measures to prevent genocidal acts, prevent and punish any direct incitement to genocide, and to take immediate measures to allow humanitarian aid into Gaza. Rieaz Shaik is South Africa's High Commissioner to Canada. High Commissioner, welcome back to the show.
Thank you for having me again, David.
Your government described this as a victory, even though the court didn't order at least the ceasefire you were hoping for, and we still have to wait a while on a full ruling on whether your allegations of genocide are carry the day. What is your reaction to the ruling?
I think my government is correct that it is a victory, but not necessarily for South Africa. It's a victory for international law. It's a victory to hold countries that act in impunity to be brought before the courts, and the court ruled that there is a plausible genocide case, and I think it's a victory at that end. It's a victory for the Palestinian people who are suffering the enormous brutality of this plausible genocide. And we think that if the decisions of the court are implemented, that there would be relief to the suffering of the Palestinian people.
That's the big question. I mean, how optimistic, how likely do you think it is that these remedies will be implemented? We've seen already Prime Minister Netanyahu say they are going to continue to conduct their military operations until they defeat Hamas. And we've seen historically in Bosnia, in Israel, in Russia, the inability to enforce ICJ rulings.
This ruling is a seismic shift in terms of world governance. There was a world before the ruling, and there's a world after the ruling. And we all now live in the world after the ruling. I think every country who's a signatory to the Genocide Convention will have an obligation to bring the decision of the court foremost into the actions of the State of Israel. And as such, Israel will be standing alone, so to speak, in respect of if it does not abide by the decisions of the court. Don't forget, David, 30 days. They have 30 days in which they've got to report to the court about how they've implemented the decisions of the court. And I think that's a game changer.
Well, why? I mean, the United States, in terms of your point on Israel standing alone, the United States said today that the ruling of the court was consistent with Washington's view that Israel has the right to take action in accordance with international law. So their biggest ally is standing with them today.
Yeah. I beg to disagree. I think the United States and other politicians and members of government who argued that our case is meritless, well, they have got two problems right now. The first is that the court found that our case is with merit insofar as the provisional measures are concerned, and therefore all those politicians, even governments who have said that the case is meritless, now stand in the real possibility, if they do not retract those statements, as being complicit to genocide. And that is something everyone has got to take into account, that their past statements, their current statements, may in fact be complicit to genocide.
The 30 days that Israel has to report back to the court on the measures they're taking to mitigate against loss of life inside Gaza, you called that a game changer. Why do you think that is a game changer?
Because in 30 days, you can imagine a situation in 30 days, if Israel has to file in the report, it can do two things. It can file the report, in which it's got to outline the measures it has undertaken in terms of humanitarian aid, all measures in regard to protecting parts and the groups of Palestinian people from genocide. Now you can imagine a situation in which Israel fails to submit a report. That will not be accepted by the world opinion, and it will not be accepted by the court, and certainly it will weaken the hands of Israel's allies, especially in the United Nations, in the General Assembly, etc., which will then decide on further action.
Right. So I just want to be clear for people watching at home. This is not a finding to the totality of your allegation that this is a genocide. This is a finding to proceed, I guess, with an investigation of that, saying that your allegations are plausible.
And I want to correct that. It is a finding of plausible genocide.
Yeah. Yes.
And that cannot be escaped. The court ruled that they believe that there is a basis for it to be called plausible genocide. It's not saying no genocide, plausible genocide, which is the standard for the provisional measures. So the standard for the provisional measures has been met, and now the world has to deal with the fact that there's a finding on plausible genocide.
And it says the allegations you've made appear to be capable of falling within the provisions of the convention. And Israel has said throughout this that it takes as many steps as possible, more steps than any other military, to defend against the unnecessary loss of civilian life. And the court says here that while such steps are to be encouraged, they are insufficient to remove the risk that irreparable prejudice will be caused before the court issues its final decision. How do you hope Israel changes the way it is conducting its military operations in Gaza? Because the Prime Minister said today it isn't going to stop. How do you want to see it adapted?
Yeah. I don't want to respond to the utterances of the Israel or its officials in regard to how they're going to violate international law. I would want to give them some advice in respect of how they should respect international law. Now, there is a finding, and the finding says, and the order says, all measures to prevent plausible genocide and all measures in respect of ensuring humanitarian assistance.
Yes.
Now, there's no way you can meet those two conditions if you do not have an implicit ceasefire. Because there's no way, if you are bombing a place, there's no way you're going to be able to take humanitarian assistance into that place that you are bombing. And this ruling is of such importance because for the first time the court has declared for all of us to know that the Palestinians as a people and as a group needs to be protected from plausible genocide.
This has been some of the immediate analysis. The point you made that the 5 or 6 orders that are spelled out here are largely impossible to implement without a ceasefire, even though the court didn't order a ceasefire. Correct. The ICJ deals with states, nations. Correct. It can't deal with an organization like Hamas, which is not a government, which is not a country. Do you believe that is why they didn't order a full ceasefire, or do you believe there was a different reason the court didn't order the full ceasefire you were seeking?
It could be in the fact that how would you make bind Hamas by a ceasefire, and it will make, in fact, it could devalue the judgment in itself if you make a demand that cannot, or ruling that cannot be implemented. But we welcome that ruling, as we welcome the court's decision or the court's order that Hamas must immediately and unconditionally release hostages. We believe that's correct. My minister, my president, has gone public today and in the past, and we've repeated it again today in the aftermath of this decision of the court, that Hamas must release all hostages unconditionally. And there's a reason for that, because we can no longer have Hamas having the hostages, which in turn keeps the peace process and the recognition of the Palestinian state hostage to the fact that they are hostages.
But on that point, I mean, if the court has no authority over Hamas, the court is calling for Hamas to release people. They can't order Hamas because of its lack of jurisdiction, correct? So it carries moral weight, but certainly
well, there's an obligation on states that do have contact with Hamas. There's an obligation on states who have an association with Hamas or a access to Hamas to make clear the decision of the court. And I think, and I'm hoping, that Hamas will be reasonable in this matter and release the hostages unconditionally, immediately, so with that can attend to the more burning, pressing issue of the day, which is the recognition of the Palestinian state.
The order in 30 days is when Israel has to come back with some sort of an explanation of the steps it's taking, or, as you say, not comply with this order. Where do you hope this conflict is in 30 days?
Well, this is a remarkable question, because on the 2nd of February 1990, the apartheid government made an announcement that they're lifting the ban on all political parties and inviting process for negotiation. So let's imagine for 1 minute that tomorrow morning, Prime Minister Netanyahu wakes up and says he is suspending all military action in regard to the Gaza, and he's inviting the Palestinians to embrace the question of peace and negotiation so that both states can live together in peace. What a wonderful day that will mean for the world. And what's good about that, it's human agency. It's human agency. God is not preventing this solution. Human beings are preventing the solution. And human beings can act in a way that produces a solution.
There is certainly nothing in Mr. Netanyahu's recent comments that would suggest a change of that magnitude, right? He has said that he sees no role for a Palestinian state in a post-war Gaza. They have made it very clear that their primary concern right now is some sort of a security arrangement that can lead to coexistence, I believe is the phrase that was used, between Israelis and Palestinians in the area, but certainly no existence of a self-determined Palestinian state. So that sort of a shift seems unlikely based on
David, that is what we lived with for 350 years under apartheid. And then one day, President de Klerk made that shift. We think it's possible to make that shift. And I hear what you're saying, that we don't think it's likely. But we've got to believe in hope that undemocratic people can produce democratic outcomes. And this is such a moment that exists for Israel, that exists for Palestine, that exists for all the countries around the world, that we must believe in the hope of a peaceful settlement of that conflict.
High Commissioner Rieaz Shaik, thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you, David.
For more reaction on this judgment, Iddo Moed is Israel's ambassador to Canada, and he joins me now. Ambassador, welcome back to the show.
Thank you for having me.
Leading up to today, your government and many of your supporters had called this allegations by South Africa baseless and meritless. Today, the court said it was plausible. What's your reaction to that finding?
The court said that the case didn't say anything about the case, whether it has any merit whatsoever. I mean, this is very clear, and it was repeated several times. What the court was asked to do is not to decide on the case. It was asked to make any kind of decision about what are the next immediate steps that needs to be done. And what the court has done is to reject the request to avoid Israel, to prevent Israel from defending itself against this genocidal terrorist organization. And so in that, the court recognizes that not only should the hostages be released immediately, which is one of the main objectives of our operation right now, but also that this case has no merit in the sense that whatever we are doing, of course, we have to make sure that as many people stay out of harm's way, which we have been doing all throughout this operation. We have to make sure that the international community is aware of that. This is what we've been doing in the past and we will continue to do in the future, and that we abide by international law, which is we have been doing up until now, and of course we are committed to continue to do in the future.
The court did not call for the outright ceasefire or for the stop of the military operations, but they put out conditions that people such as the High Commissioner for South Africa and others say are almost impossible to meet if you continue with your military operation the way it's been going.
David, there were no conditions. The court asked Israel to take into consideration the fact that there are people on the ground, which we, of course, are very well aware of. And so when we are talking about innocent people and keeping people out of harm's way, this is what we have, exactly what we have been doing. We are faced with a genocidal terrorist organization that is embedding itself among the population. And of course, this genocidal terrorist organization it's not an entity that abides by international law. On the contrary, it abuses international law in a way that may put Israel in jeopardy in this case, but it does not, because we abide by international law. And this is exactly what we have been doing.
It says here, in the judgment that it talks about the steps you've pointed to that you take to minimize civilian casualties, but it says, while steps such as these are to be encouraged, they are insufficient, is what they've said, that the way it's been conducted so far has not minimized the civilian loss and the destruction of property in the way that the court would like to see. So are you saying that this is not instructing you to do things differently or
what it says,
change?
The court says exactly what we have been what we have been saying. The number of casualties is high. It is any casualty is too high. Any number of people, innocent people whose lives are lost, is too high for us. and for the Palestinians, and we understand that. But we did not choose to fight this terrorist organization. They have chosen to target Israelis, to kill Israelis, and to continue to do it again and again, given the opportunity. So there is no way for us to stop this war, because otherwise this monster will rise again and try to kill more Israelis. This is clear. This is what they have been saying, and this is what they are doing. They continue to shoot at us, and they will continue to do that unless we are completely victorious against them.
So you see no suggestion that Israel should change its military tactics and its approach inside Gaza based on the findings here and the order to come back in 30 days and explain how you're going to do things differently from a military perspective?
We have to be very clear on what the court said. The court did not say Israel did not do it in the past, please do it in the future. The court said take these issues into consideration. This is exactly what we have been doing. This is exactly what the military has been doing for a very long period of time. And this is whatever we are doing within our operation against the Hamas is not directed against the Palestinian people. We've made that clear. We are actually trying to protect them against Hamas when we are facilitating their movement in the Gaza Strip from areas where they may be in harm's way, and we know that Hamas will try to keep them there. So our military are risking their lives in order for Palestinians to move from one area to another to get to areas of shelter that we have informed them in advance that they can have safe havens in. We have to remember that we are dealing here with a lopsided international mechanism that actually accuses Israel, which is acting in self-defense against a genocidal organization. And in doing that, abused by South Africa, that has also welcomed another convicted genocidal leader of Sudan. In doing that, they're trying to tie our hands in our self-defense. This is, of course, this is outrageous. And so we will continue to defend ourselves, and we will continue to abide by international law.
So my conversation with the High Commissioner and then my conversation with you, I mean, obviously two countries with very different views on this, but you have very different interpretations of this judgment. You know, the High Commissioner for South Africa says this is a finding of a plausible genocide being committed by the people of Israel, or by the military of Israel, and you're saying that this is a vindication of the conduct of Israel. I mean, both cannot be true. The word plausible is used by the justices in the writing here, and just as the word insufficient is used when talking about efforts to protect civilians. So how should the rest of the world view those key phrases?
I'm not going to compare whatever I'm saying with a country that hosted a convicted genocidal leader, because I think that their interpretation of international law must be different than mine, for sure. So that's not any kind of argument that I'm going to conduct. However, whatever the court says, we are reading very carefully. And again, we have reiterated, as Prime Minister has said, Israel is a law-abiding country. And when it comes to international humanitarian law, we are making sure that whoever is not part of this monstrous genocidal mechanism called Hamas will be, as much as possible, kept out of harm's way. And we have numerous demonstrations how we've done that and how we will continue to do that, even when we have to risk Israeli lives. Just the other day, to give an example, 21 Israeli soldiers were killed when a bomb went off through an attack of Hamas, when they were trying to destroy infrastructure of Hamas. We could have bombed this place. We just could have dropped a bomb from the air. But we are doing it in a different way, because we understand that we are operating in an area that is filled with humans, with people who are not part of this mechanism. And we are trying to distinguish between them as much as possible. But let me just give you an example. When you're looking at a hospital or a medical installation, where we find missiles hidden below this installation, they are shot from that installation into Israel, to a densely populated area. And I ask you and ask our viewers, what would you do as somebody who is in charge of the protection of lives in Israel when an attack is coming from an area that is actually protected, like a hospital? Does it become a military target or not? That's the question that international law allows us to weigh.
Right. No, I understand that, and it has been months of grim moral calculus in this particular thing. But, you know, and I know you disagree with the numbers from the Gaza Health Ministry, or Israel at least questions the numbers from the Gaza Health Ministry, because it is a Hamas-run organization. But the death toll is north of 25,000 now. And I know, I believe the IDF has said about 9,000 of that would be Hamas militants, is the most recent figure I've seen. That's still 15, 16, 17,000 civilians. You know, at what point does it become even too much for Israel to bear on that front? I appreciate Hamas uses hospitals, Hamas uses schools. I appreciate all of that. But there's a lot of kids, there's a lot of women, there's a lot of non-combatants dying as a result of this, and now this decision drops. At what point is it too much?
When it's one. Just one. One is too many. We cherish life. We want to protect life. We want to protect ourselves. We want to protect our neighbors. This is exactly what we did until October the 7th, 2023. With our military might, we could have done something else. We have chosen to take a period of 3 weeks to prepare for a military operation, which we are conducting very meticulously. We know that it is a very complicated operation, and therefore we have tried, and we are still working very hard to warn the population to get away from harm's way. And we will continue to do that. But we have a monster that is facing us, that has killed 1,200 people. And so, and vow to continue to do that. So we have to do this, we have to conduct this operation, we have no other choice. We understand that the numbers are huge. We also understand our duty and responsibility to facilitate the provision of assistance to the population, and we are doing that in all possible ways.
So the court has said that within 30 days they would like a report. They're insisting on a report from Israel explaining how they're going to change the way they're conducting the military operations to further minimize the loss of innocent life. Will your country comply with that? Will they change their military operations and adopt new tactics and justify it to the court?
I'm not sure we're talking about the same thing. A report or information that Israel would provide about the way it's conducting its operation are already distributed on the media everywhere, and we will continue to do that, and we'll also inform the court of all of that. When it comes to changing whatever we're changing, that's a tactical decision that is based on attaining the goals that we have in front of us. And we have to release 136 hostages that are still kept somewhere in the tunnels underneath the Gaza Strip in small cells. We have to remember they are hungered, they are starved, they are raped, they are mutilated. We have no idea what is happening with these people. And no country in the world will abandon its citizens, its civilians, in a way like in such conditions. We have to keep this fight. We are abiding by international law. We'll also inform the court again, as we did before. We will continue to inform the court and all the international community of the way we are upholding international humanitarian law, specifically in this context. And we will make sure that we will have our hostages back as soon as possible, and that Hamas will not be a source of threat to Israel in the future.
Just as a final point, Ambassador, I mean, this is a 17-person panel of judges, I believe, and most of the votes seem to have gone 15-2, but there was one that went 16-1, and that the Israeli appointed justice voted with this one to increase the amount of humanitarian aid into Gaza. What do you need to do there? How do you make that happen?
We indeed understand that we have to do whatever is possible to get as much as possible humanitarian aid inside. So from our side, we are increasing the systems, the mechanisms, the security checks, whatever is necessary to add and augment the number of trucks that have been going into the Gaza Strip of aid, of food, of medical supplies, everything. We understand that, and we will continue to increase and do our utmost to make sure that as much as possible flows into the Gaza Strip. We have to remember that much of it is stopped by Hamas, and much of it does not get to its end destination. We have to remember that there are other organizations there that are dealing with that. So, but as far as Israel is concerned, we will continue to do our utmost to allow for this provision to go inside the Gaza Strip.
But, sorry, I know I said a final point, but one more final point. A lot of people have read this decision, though, as suggesting that you haven't done enough to get aid in and you haven't done enough to protect civilians. You reject that interpretation of this ruling?
I would say again that we are doing our utmost under the conditions of fighting a war against a genocidal terrorist organization that is holding 136 hostages underneath the ground in the most horrendous conditions, of which we have no ideas of their whereabouts or their conditions themselves. We are doing our utmost to protect the civilian population of Gaza as much as we can, militarily, humanitarian, any way we can. And we will continue to do that while attaining our goals.
Iddo Moed, Israel's ambassador to Canada. Thank you again for your time today, sir.
Thank you.
Okay, for more on today's ruling, Mona Abuamara is the chief representative of the Palestinian delegation to Canada, and she joins me now in the studio. Mona Abuamara, welcome back to the show.
Hi, David.
You heard what the Israeli ambassador there, what Iddo Moed said. He said that in his view, today's ruling was a win for Israel, and it made it clear that Israel is defending itself against evil. How do you interpret this ruling?
Well, had that been the truth, we wouldn't have seen Israeli government officials so angry about the ruling and calling it out, calling it anti-Semitic and refusing its premise. The ambassador mentioned that the case was meritless and that the court agreed to that. And I really disagree, because had that been the truth again, we wouldn't have seen provisional orders or ruling made today. That's the main win. There is a case. There is a plausible case that Israel is committing genocide, and the court is doing everything. You said it fell short of actually calling out Israel to stop its genocide and aggression. But as you look into the provisions and the rulings that had been done, and since we know that Israel's aim is not against Hamas, but against the Palestinian people. So stopping those would be stopping the aggression, because every time Israel makes an act, it is killing members of the group and causing bodily and mental harm, and obliterating deliberately destruction to buildings and the livelihood of the Palestinians.
Right. Yeah. I did ask Iddo Moed quite a few times. The use of the word plausible in the judgment is what is really standing out here, because this is what they use as the basis to order these interim measures. But what the court didn't order was that ceasefire. Do you see that as a failure, that the ceasefire wasn't ordered by the ICJ?
Not at all. It wasn't the main purpose, because had it even called for a ceasefire, we know that Israel wouldn't abide by it. So that was not the main failure, that as Israel calls it. It's the way that Israel is portraying it, instead of thinking that the whole world, including the highest international court of justice, is calling what it's doing a plausible case for genocide. So it needs to re-examine its steps on the ground.
There is a 30-day deadline for Israel to inform the court of actions it's taking to comply with the interim measures. The provisions are meant to be binding, but they have proven in many other court rulings by the ICJ to be unenforceable. If people don't comply, the UN Security Council is supposed to enforce them. We know how the veto system works there. How optimistic are you that things may actually change inside Gaza, that Israel may change how it's conducting its military operations based on this finding from the court today?
Well, what I know is that what was yesterday is not like what's happening today and tomorrow. Every act by Israel would be looked at very closely and examined against the ruling of the ICJ. And again, because we know that Israel's main purpose is genocidal. It's for ethnic cleansing and forcible transfer of the Palestinian people, of 2.3 million Palestinians in Gaza, but also on people in the West Bank and East Jerusalem. So for that reason, we know that it can't fulfill the requirements of the ruling.
Well, I mean, you well know Israel would argue with that interpretation of this, and they've talked about the need for coexistence while at the same time rejecting a two-state solution. And we heard from Prime Minister Netanyahu today saying they're going to continue their military operations inside Gaza until they've dealt with Hamas to their satisfaction. So what do you think this conflict will look like 30 days from now? Like, will this I don't want to, will this court decision, will it actually change things, or do you think we'll just continue with what we've seen so far?
Well, now it's a test for the international courts themselves, for the Security Council, and for third states. It's the responsibility, again, the one that we have been calling for 75 years. It's the international community's responsibility to now implement its own laws without putting Palestine as an exception.
There was also the call by the court today for Hamas to unconditionally and immediately release the hostages. And Iddo Moed said to me after our interview that a position Israel has said many times that they will stop the fighting if the hostages are released. Do you think Hamas should do that? Do you think they will enter into any kind of, I know you're not part of Hamas and don't speak for Hamas, so I'm not asking you to do that, but do you think they may enter into any kind of a conversation about a further release of hostages? Because I know the U.S. is trying to broker that now.
What I think is that this is another charade, because since the beginning of this aggression on Gaza, there was a deal that was not accepted by Israel to stop the aggression and releasing the hostages. And there were multiple efforts after that. And I need Ambassador Moed to ask the parents, the families of the hostages, if they think that that's Israel's goal, is to release them.
Right. I mean, do you think Hamas should comply with this order? I believe President Abbas has called for this.
I think all parties, when we refer our cases to international courts, we do that fully knowing that we will also be responsible for anything that comes out of it. So any orders should be followed. It doesn't matter what party it's on, it's binding for all parties. So yes, of course.
Right, so the two parties of this conflict can't pick and choose which ones they like. All of them should be complied with, is your position.
Of course, but the two parties in this case are South Africa and Israel, not Israel and Hamas, because Hamas is not
a nation,
state.
Right, and so there's no jurisdiction.
And that is what Israel tries to conflate all the time to make it seem that it's war.
Canada issued a statement today on the ICJ ruling, reiterating essentially the neutral position it's carved out here, voicing support for the ICJ's role in upholding international law, but not saying it necessarily endorses the case that South Africa has brought. How satisfied are you with that position by the Trudeau government on this?
Not at all satisfied. It's the opposite of that. I'm shocked and saddened by the statement that I've seen. Remember the last time I was on your show, I was defending those neutral statements that were coming. But today's statement reminded me of a lot of other dehumanizing statements, anti-Palestinian statements that have been coming out from the Canadian government. And it reminds me of yesterday's statement as well about the first bilateral declaration meeting between Minister Joly and Israel's foreign minister, who is a main character of incitement against the Palestinians and part of this case as well.
Why do you say that statement was dehumanizing? Because it did call for increased humanitarian aid, the release of hostages, the minimization of civilian casualties, which have been enormous throughout this conflict. Why was it dehumanizing in your view?
What do you mean by minimizing casualties? Does it mean that instead of Israel killing 5,000, it should kill 1,000? Palestinians are not a charity case, and our cause is not one for a religious cause or a humanitarian cause. So asking to provide humanitarian assistance without calling out. Exactly, we are not numbers, but when you imagine that there are 26,000+ with thousands under the rubble, and this is the reaction on Canada's side part, and when this foreign minister comes out and talks in such a horrific way in an EU meeting about creating an artificial island to put Gazans on. And then even that island, which they would run to apparently, is controlled by Israel. So this mentality of supremacy and racism and control and oppression, we can't imagine Canada not calling that out and instead reiterating Israel's self-defense, which is part of the green lighting that started all of this madness on October 8th, when all leaders were coming out and talking about Israel's right to defend itself. This is what got us here.
The rulings of this court are intended to be enforced by the United Nations Security Council. I've seen some reporting today that there may be efforts to escalate it to the UN Security Council to try to get some sort of a resolution on the enforcing of it. I don't know if the U.S. would veto it, but it has vetoed significant, I think 3 or 4 times now, various rulings targeting Israel, because part of the Russia-U.S. dynamic is a big one at play there. What happens if this goes to the UN Security Council and it goes nowhere and it gets vetoed? What message does that send?
Well, we are not going to stand there. We are going to work towards an implementation, work towards knocking every door and every venue. And as I told you, these binding rulings, maybe they can't be enforced in the Security Council, but they are still binding to everyone. And even those countries, and that's what makes me baffled by Canada's statement. Even countries like Germany and France, the way they came out with how they agreed with to implement whatever ruling comes out
and they've
of
opposed the genocide allegation.
They were actually in support of the Israeli case, so they came out on that side, and yet. So for Canada, the champion of the rules-based international order, it does not make sense how, when it comes to Palestine, everything changes.
Do you think they're just waiting for the final verdict? That's the stance, or what do you think is happening there?
Had they been in that position, they wouldn't have added all of this talk about self-defense. No, they're standing with Israel on this.
Mona Abuamara, Chief Representative of the Palestinian Delegation to Canada. I always appreciate your time. Thanks for coming in today.